Good morning, guys. Like a preposition or the Bible, this video comes to you in two parts. One, Shane Dawson or Game of Thrones, and then two, the media distortion field. So I was having a conversation with my coworker today, and they were talking about how big Game of Thrones is, like how big of a viewership Game of Thrones is, how large of a cultural impact Game of Thrones has, and how it's just everywhere. And I thought to myself, oh, Game of Thrones isn't that large. It's no larger than Shane Dawson. Shane Dawson has the same viewership or audience reach that Game of Thrones does. And we went back and forth. My coworker thought there's no way this could be true. In fact, some other people got involved and they thought, no, Game of Thrones is way bigger. That's all people ever talk about. And I said, yeah, but Shane Dawson is really big on YouTube. You know, I don't know. A lot of people talk about Shane Dawson, and they thought Shane Dawkins. I never heard of him. I thought, all right. Just because you guys don't watch YouTube doesn't mean I don't. Second of all, your ignorance of pop culture is not a sign of your intellectual prowess, Mr. Thou who shall not go named. Nonetheless, after a few Wikipedia articles, Nielsen ratings, Slack back and forth, arguments, repartees, we eventually arrived at the figures, which is that it's hitting into the mid-30s to mid-20 million viewership. That's globally. That's the US viewers, that's the US viewers on TV, that's all the HBO Go digital downloads. So we're talking, let's say 35 million views, right, in total, cumulatively, per episode. And then of that, about 40% of those 35 million views are coming from the HBO Go subscription, right? Digital views. So that's not that far off from Shane Dawson's video series, specifically on Tana Manjo, whatever her name is, and Shane Dawson's series on Jake Paul. I mean, his videos were of equal length, hour-long, 2-hour-long videos that had 20, 30 million views. I thought, they're the exact same. For all the talk about how big Game of Thrones is and how much we hear people talking about it, Shane Dawson has just as many viewers and just as big of a cultural reach and cultural impact. And this leads me to, why do people think that Game of Thrones is bigger than Shane Dawson? Well, part of the back and forth was one discovery in a New York Times study. And the New York Times found that, one, Game of Thrones is much more popular on coastal cities than it is in middle America, for instance. So in some ways, this skews what we feel is important. Conversely, they found Duck Dynasty is much more popular in the South than on the coast. But for Game of Thrones, because Game of Thrones is very popular in coastal cities compared to, Kansas, and most of the media is located on coastal cities, ergo, the same people that are in media are more likely to watch Game of Thrones and therefore more likely to talk about Game of Thrones than Shane Dawson. But because the media in some ways dictates what's in the conversation, and Game of Thrones is what's in the media's conversation, they're more likely to tweet about it, they're more likely to write articles about it because it's more popular in New York City, LA, Chicago, Philadelphia, San Francisco. That creates a kind of distortion field about what we, as everybody in the United States, views as popular or in the cultural zeitgeist or having a big impact. When in reality, that's not always the case, right? So this is a great example of how the media has kind of a distortion field, and that whatever the media feels is important is then related and projected out towards the rest of the country, and we're told that this is important. And for most of us, we just assume oh, I guess it is important. And if we're beamed in to our daily television shows or our nightly news or our Twitter feeds that this is important, and then we pick up on it, then we start talking about it and feel it is important because we want to be part of the conversation. But it creates this outsized perception of its actual numbers and viewing figures, when in reality, as I said earlier, Game of Thrones, the totality of Game of Thrones viewership is mid-30 million. That's it. That's total streams, television watches, everything. Mid-30 millions. Same as Shane Dawson. On top of that, because the demographic is slightly different, it also once again shifts how we perceive what things are popular and what things aren't. Most of the people working in media, one, are in coastal cities like Chicago and it's not like Michigan, New York, San Francisco, LA, and two, they're slightly older, right? Game of Thrones is going to skew towards somebody that's in their mid-20s or mid-30s than Shane Dawson, who's going to skew to somebody who's in their teenage years. But because of that doesn't make a difference in terms of what actually has cultural impact or reach or viewership. Just because they're not in your orbit field or you've never heard of Shane Dawson before doesn't mean it's actually not as large or if not bigger than Game of Thrones or whatever is in your perceived bubble. And it's funny, Game of Thrones is a great example of how what's in the media's bubble, they perceive, Game of Thrones to be big because that's what everybody's talking about. Therefore, what gets sucked into the media bubble is then pushed out into the larger cultural conversation, and then we indeed think it's bigger than it actually is. Right? For instance, like T-Series, right? The ongoing battle between PewDiePie and T-Series, because it happened mainly on YouTube, it wasn't covered as much in kind of mainstream media, and therefore most people haven't heard of it unless they're existing or getting their news on YouTube or, you know, following PewDiePie or in India. It's not being covered in kind of mainstream Twitter or the kind of cultural commentary at classic news that gets beamed, you know, from New York City into the Twitter. Then Twitter gets write-ups and posts about it, and then it's covered in the kind of ABC, CNN, nightly news programs that are then viewed by everybody in the country. So that's what I mean when there's kind of a media distortion field, and that whatever enters into the media's bubble is then projected into the wider cultural conversation, regardless if it's actually warranted or actually relevant to the wider cultural conversation. Like, most states in the United States are rural states. They're not California and New York. So most states actually don't watch that much Game of Thrones. Of the 30 million viewers, right, most of them exist in the coast. And because most of them exist in the coast, those are the ones that are just media by default, and then they get beamed back into Nebraska and Arkansas and Oklahoma, when in reality, that may not be the most, you know, watched show. But nonetheless, we're kind of tricked and convinced into thinking that Game of Thrones is the big popular zeitgeist that is perceived to be, when really it's no bigger than Shane Dawson. So it's interesting to think about how what media picks up and feels as popular is then circulated within its internal, you know, kind of social distortion field and then pushed out. And that we're always viewing everything through the kind of lens of the media, and who's ever controlling the media controls the lens at which we perceive things are important or not important. Therefore, you know, this is a very relatively lighthearted case, but we can go down the rabbit hole in terms of talking about like war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan, you know, geopolitical relations with Russia, geopolitical relations with China. Nonetheless, a great example is like how there is an internal bias to feeling like Game of Thrones is much bigger and more popular than somebody like Shane Dawson, even though they have equal viewership. Something to think about. Anyway, I'll catch you guys tomorrow. If you want to subscribe, that'd be great. You can click around for another video. Thanks as always for watching, guys. See you tomorrow. Bye.